He was humiliated in front of an entire cabin, forced out of a seat he paid for simply because of the color of his skin, and while they laughed, whispered, and watched him walk to the back of the plane, not one of them knew they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a system glitch. This was something much darker, something too many people are still too comfortable ignoring. What started as a flight quickly unraveled into a quiet war of assumptions, power, and prejudice. And by the time this plane landed, reputations would collapse, secrets would be exposed, and the very people who mocked him would be the ones left speechless. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? And which part of this story you saw coming, if any? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is not just a flight. This is what happens when judgment meets the wrong man. The terminal at Gate 27 was alive with the usual movement of early boarding, the hushed rustle of garment bags, rolling wheels on polished floors, and the soft murmurs of priority passengers confirming their upgrades. Among them stood Ellison Langston, tall, composed, and immaculately dressed in a tailored dark suit that gave him the effortless authority of someone used to closed-door meetings in quiet, decisive power. He carried nothing flashy, just a leather briefcase, a watch older than most of the gate agents, and a boarding pass tucked into his inner pocket for seat 1A. He waited without urgency, not because he had nowhere to be, but because he had never needed to prove his right to be anywhere. The boarding announcement chimed, calling first class and elite tiers. Langston stepped forward calmly and handed over his pass to the uniformed woman at the scanner. Her name tag read Fallon. She smiled the way people do when they're unsure if they're about to make a mistake or avoid one. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Langston, and something in her posture shifted. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, and the practiced smile she wore tensed just slightly at the corners. "Sir," she said cautiously, "I think there's a minor seating issue. If you wouldn't mind stepping to the side while we sort it out." Langston studied her for a beat. No irritation, no confusion, just observation. He nodded once and moved aside. Fallon made a quick call on her headset, her voice low, clipped, and efficient. A second gate agent appeared and murmured something while glancing discreetly toward the rear. Fallon returned and motioned him forward. "There's been an update to the seating manifest. Due to an equipment balance issue, you've been reassigned." Langston didn't blink. "To what seat?" 28C, sir." He allowed a breath of silence to pass between them. "Coach." "A window seat," Fallon added quickly, as if that made it better. "I see." He said it evenly, voice low, unshaken. "I purchased my ticket 3 weeks ago. Non-refundable first class." Fallon nodded, the way people nod when they want to avoid confrontation. The system sometimes reconfigures seating for balance. "It's nothing personal." "Of course," Langston said, letting the words sit cold in the air. "I never assumed it was." She offered a voucher. He declined it without speaking. He glanced past her toward the boarding ramp, just in time to see a man step through with a loud voice and easy swagger. White, mid-40s, laughing into his phone. Expensive suit. Fallon smiled at him, really smiled, and waved him through. The man didn't stop to show a boarding pass. He walked straight down the jetway. A moment later, the crew at the plane's entrance poured him a glass of champagne. Langston saw the glass tilt into his hand just before the door closed. He turned back to Fallon. "So I've been removed from my seat, and someone else now occupies it." Fallon didn't answer. A man in a blazer with a clipped ID badge approached. His name was Conrad. "Is there a concern, sir?" "There is," Langston replied. "Your team reassigned a paid seat without notice, offered no reason beyond a vague excuse, and declined to say who now sits in that seat." Conrad's response was smooth, generic, practiced. The aircraft needed to adjust its balance due to booking inconsistencies. These adjustments are standard. And who authorized it? That's internal information. Langston didn't flinch. Understood. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a phone, smaller, sleeker than the one he used earlier. No password screen. Just a fingerprint and a blinking green light. He typed a single line, redirect flag, seating override, confirm reason, and hit send. Fallon spoke again, her voice thinner now. If you'll take your new seat, we're almost ready for final boarding. Langston said nothing. Instead, he folded the phone back into his pocket and waited. A minute later, Fallon's screen beeped. Her eyes scanned the message and froze. Then she whispered something to Conrad, barely audible. Conrad's jaw tensed. They both looked at Langston with an expression halfway between concern and confusion. Sir, would you mind stepping over to the customer service counter? Our regional supervisor would like a word. Of course, Langston replied. His voice never rose. His expression never cracked. He walked slowly, deliberately. Around them, other passengers filed past. Some threw him sidelong glances. Others avoided his gaze. One whispered something about upgrades being abused lately. Langston heard it. He always did. The quiet judgments were never really quiet. At the counter, the supervisor didn't speak right away, just nodded and stared at the screen as if trying to process something unexpected. Langston waited, not impatient, not passive, just still. A second later, a notification dinged across 3 terminals in unison. Onboard systems, gate assignments, corporate escalation. The supervisor swallowed and finally spoke. Thank you for your patience, sir. There's been an error. You're being reinstated in 1A. We sincerely apologize. Langston nodded once. As he adjusted the armrest, the hush around him became a kind of signal, a cue for something uglier to emerge beneath the civility. A tall woman in uniform approached the front of the cabin, her stride clipped and her posture erect with self-importance. Her name tag gleamed under the downlight, but her expression was what caught Langston's attention. Her eyes gave him a full scan, from his shoes to his tie, lingering not with curiosity, but with that practiced skepticism worn by those who confuse proximity to power with ownership of it. She did not address him directly. Instead, she turned slightly to a nearby passenger, leaned in as if to whisper something, then cast a brief glance toward Langston again, her mouth curving into a knowing smirk as if she had confirmed something for herself. He said nothing, kept his eyes ahead, hands folded calmly over his lap, but he felt the burn of judgment as tangibly as heat. He had sat in seats like this before, on flights across oceans, in rooms filled with silent resentment cloaked in politeness. But this wasn't politeness anymore. This was theater, and she had just played her part. From across the aisle, a man in his 60s with a ruddy complexion and a gut that strained against his monogrammed shirt leaned toward his companion, a soft chuckle escaping him like steam from a pressurized valve. His voice was low, but not low enough. Guess they're letting anyone up here these days, huh? His companion gave a lazy laugh, the kind meant to deflect but still agree, and sipped his wine without looking over. Langston turned his head just slightly, enough to acknowledge but not engage. This wasn't new. This was expected. He knew how quickly the subtle could become overt when unchecked. Moments later, the smirking flight attendant returned, this time with a tray in hand. But she didn't approach Langston. She stopped at 1B, the seat beside him now filled by a middle-aged man in a pale blue shirt who had spent the last 5 minutes side-eyeing Langston, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit his worldview. She handed him a drink and leaned in with a smile that was all teeth and camaraderie. "We've upgraded your scotch, Mr. Riley, compliments of the flight crew." Riley nodded without thanks, his attention still fixed on the man beside him who didn't match his mental blueprint of what a first-class neighbor should look like. Langston kept his posture relaxed, but his mind recorded every detail, every glance, every withheld courtesy, every line crossed in silence. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He never did. He simply didn't look away when one approached. The attendant made her way down the aisle, greeting others with more familiarity, more ease, more effort. To Langston, she hadn't yet said a word. Even the standard welcome had been skipped, as if he had merely materialized in the seat and could be ignored until he vanished. The contrast in tone was deliberate. A few rows back, someone let out a soft, dismissive cough, followed by a louder whisper. Bet that seat wasn't his in the first place. The laughter that followed was sharp, restrained only by proximity, not decency. Langston didn't react. He'd learned long ago that public humiliation didn't need volume to be effective. It only needed coordination. It only needed complicity. And this cabin, for all its polished metal and curated playlists, was already playing a chorus of unspoken agreement. A different attendant approached him, younger, her steps less assured, tablet in hand. She paused beside his row and checked her screen, her lips parting slightly when she read the manifest. She blinked, as if realizing something wasn't right. Her eyes darted briefly to her colleague near the front, then back to Langston. "Would you care for a drink, sir?" Her voice was careful, the kind people used when trying to correct a mistake they didn't make. Langston nodded. "Sparkling water, please." The girl nodded quickly and disappeared down the aisle. He appreciated her effort, but knew better than to believe it would change the tone already set. The curtain had risen, and the roles were being played to perfection. Minutes passed. The engine hum deepened. A woman in row 2 leaned forward slightly and tapped the shoulder of the man in 1B. Something about not seeing men like that in this section. Langston heard it. It wasn't meant for him, but it was meant to be heard. The comment hung in the air like smoke, harmless to those who created it, choking to those forced to breathe it in. The tray table clicked open. His water arrived. No garnish, no coaster, just a bottle and a cup, unceremoniously placed with a flat apology muttered more to the air than to him. Around him, service continued at a higher standard. Lemons in glasses, linen napkins folded just so, names remembered, preferences honored. His presence, by contrast, had been relegated to procedural obligation. And still, he said nothing. Still, he waited. They hadn't figured it out yet. Not the attendants, not the seatmates, not the passengers whispering and smirking and stealing glances. They didn't know what the system had done when it tried to humiliate him. They didn't realize that the man sitting in 1A, quiet and still, wasn't just a passenger. He was the observer. The flight attendants continued their work, delivering refreshments and offering empty smiles to their preferred clientele. But Ellison noticed a shift, the kind that starts as a ripple and builds into a pattern. His sparkling water had remained untouched, and when a second attendant passed by, he raised a hand with the calm intention of requesting the menu he hadn't yet been offered. The attendant, a broad-shouldered man with neatly parted hair and the too crisp efficiency of someone trying to impress, paused briefly beside him. "Sir, are you sure you're in the correct section?" The words were delivered with bureaucratic neutrality, but their weight dropped like lead. Langston met the man's gaze with the same silence he had held since boarding, letting the question hang. "I mean, we've had some reassignment confusion today," the attendant added quickly. "Would you mind confirming your seat with your boarding pass?" Langston reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved the pass, and held it out without a word. The attendant scanned it, eyes flicking from the card to the seat number, then back to Langston with a slight twitch of confusion in his brow. After a pause, he handed it back without apology. "Thank you, sir. Enjoy the flight." Then he turned and walked away without another word, but not before whispering something into the calm on his collar. Langston could feel the familiar tension tightening across his shoulders, not because of the question, but because of what came after. Because of what always came after. A minute later, another flight attendant approached. This one wore a gold pin, suggesting seniority, and a practiced look of calm control that rarely concealed the truth beneath. She stopped beside his seat and began to speak in the same voice reserved for delivering corporate policy through a veil of civility. "Mr. Langston, I understand there may have been a misunderstanding earlier. First class has certain standards we must maintain for the comfort and expectations of our premium guests." Her eyes did not blink as she said it, as if reciting a phrase she had learned by heart. Langston responded only by slightly tilting his head, an invitation for her to continue explaining what she clearly didn't have the courage to say plainly. She hesitated, then pressed on. "If there's anything you need, please do not hesitate to call. But we ask all passengers to remain considerate of the space and experience of others around them." He didn't speak. He didn't move. She forced a smile, dipped her head in farewell, and walked away. Seconds passed before the next insult arrived, not from the crew, but from the seat behind him. A man leaned forward slightly, tapping the shoulder of the attendant who had just passed. He wore a designer sport coat, his silver hair carefully styled to suggest effortless wealth. "I'd be happy to trade," he said, motioning toward Langston's row. "If the gentleman's presence is causing discomfort, maybe I could switch and make everyone's flight a bit more seamless." The attendant hesitated, startled by the directness. Langston heard it, as did the couple across the aisle, who now whispered more openly. The offer was made with the tone of noblesse oblige, a solution masquerading as generosity, when it was anything but. But the response was worse. The attendant shook her head slightly and whispered something that sounded rehearsed. "That won't be necessary. He's been verified. We've made our decision." Langston didn't react, not visibly, but inside the line had been crossed. Not just the assumption that his presence was negotiable, but the outright statement that he had been verified, as if his place in that seat required some extraordinary exception. He could feel the heat beginning to build in his chest, not rage, not even indignation, but something colder. A calculation, a tally, and this cabin was running up a debt. The man behind him gave a small snort and settled back in his seat with a murmured, "Well, if no one else will say it." Another voice, softer and female, muttered that the crew was being far too tolerant these days. Langston exhaled slowly, silently. He did not move. He would not move. This flight was no longer about transportation. It was now a record. Every moment was being filed. Every interaction time-stamped in his mind, the ledger growing longer. He glanced to his side and saw the man next to him flipping through a magazine, deliberately avoiding eye contact, as if silence offered immunity. It never did. A younger flight attendant passed by again, this time offering him a menu with a quiet apology buried beneath professional tone. "Would you like to make a dinner selection, sir?" Langston accepted it with a nod, and as she turned, he caught her glance toward the senior attendant, the same one who had earlier questioned his presence. The moment the curtain to the galley drew open and the lead flight attendant stepped forward, he knew this next act was planned. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before, someone who knew exactly how to enforce control while maintaining a posture of hospitality. Her uniform was crisp, every step measured, every expression calculated. She paused in the aisle as if to adjust her sleeve, then turned toward Langston's row with a smile that had no warmth and eyes that gleamed with a private decision already made. "Sir, I'd like to ask you to accompany me to the front," she said, her voice syrupy with a kind of forced patience that carried the weight of accusation hidden beneath courtesy. Langston didn't respond right away. The silence drew the attention of the passengers around him, eyes lifting from newspapers and tablets, ears perking at the possibility of confrontation. When Langston finally turned his head toward her, his expression hadn't changed, but there was steel in the movement, a kind of refusal embedded in posture alone. She gestured slightly behind her, and that's when Langston noticed them. Two men in black security polos had appeared just past the forward galley, standing shoulder to shoulder like bookends to a conversation that hadn't started yet. They didn't move forward, but their presence was the message. The attendant smiled again. "It seems there was an issue with the manifest, and for security purposes, we'd like to reconfirm your boarding information. Nothing urgent, of course. Just standard protocol." Langston said nothing. His hand moved slowly to retrieve his boarding pass again, holding it up, unfolded, in full view, the seat number printed clearly. The attendant didn't even look at it. She nodded once to the security officers, and they stepped forward. One placed a hand near his belt, not threatening, but not casual either. "Sir, we ask that you comply. This is a federal aircraft, and we reserve the right to confirm the identity of any passenger." Langston stood, slow and composed, his coat still folded in his lap. As he rose to full height, the lead attendant took a half step back, her confidence faltering just slightly before recovering behind a professional mask. He did not argue. He did not ask why. He simply picked up his briefcase, adjusted his cuffs, and allowed himself to be escorted down the aisle. But if the crew expected submission to equal silence, they had miscalculated. The cabin had grown quieter now, passengers leaning away from their seats to watch, some whispering, others pretending not to see, all of them complicit in their inaction. A woman in 3C reached for her phone, paused, then slowly lowered it, thinking better of recording the moment. A man across the aisle cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Langston walked between them all, not with shame, but with purpose. His stride was calm, but the silence trailing behind him was louder than any confrontation. One passenger muttered something as he passed. Another exhaled a small huff of vindicated satisfaction. The security officers guided him into the galley, and there, just behind the flight deck, stood a narrow bench and a wall panel with a keypad. The lead attendant now replaced her smile with her real face, a look of cold control. "We're trying to resolve this quickly," she said, though her tone betrayed no urgency. Langston reached again into his pocket, not for the boarding pass this time, but for his other phone. The matte black device blinked once as he powered it. He typed a message without looking up. Escalation Protocol 4. Gate B12. Verification breach. Request confirmation. Then he set the phone down beside him, letting it sit in plain view. One of the officers glanced at it, then at the attendant. She hesitated. The display lit up again. A single response. Received. Confirmation in motion. Langston watched her reaction shift slightly. Her jaw stiffened. Her eyes moved quickly across his face now, reading something she hadn't expected. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, passengers speculated freely. One claimed he'd seen Langston switch seats. Another insisted he must have been flying standby. A third, sipping wine, commented loudly that people need to stop pretending they're something they're not. Each theory fed off the silence of those who knew better but refused to speak. A few rows back, the younger flight attendant from earlier stood frozen near the drink cart, watching the galley door with wide eyes, torn between duty and conscience. Minutes passed. Tension coiled like wire between every breath. Then, suddenly, a new voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We're experiencing a minor procedural delay. We appreciate your patience and will be underway shortly." The voice was calm, but beneath it Langston detected something new, uncertainty. Back in the galley, the lead attendant stepped forward again, her voice lower now. "We've re-verified your seat. You may return to 1A, sir." There was no apology. There never was. Langston retrieved his phone and stood. The officers stepped aside. He returned to the aisle as silently as he had left, but the passengers were louder now, shifting, whispering, adjusting themselves to accommodate the discomfort they had helped create. Some avoided eye contact. He remained in 1A, silent and still, watching not just the passengers now, but the crew. Patterns had begun to fracture. People were no longer moving as they had been before. The senior flight attendant had retreated to the galley and had yet to return. The junior staff moved with hesitant urgency, glancing at each other too often, whispering at odd intervals, carrying trays that seemed heavier than drinks and menus. Langston noticed a young man in a gray maintenance vest step out from the service corridor and approach the front bulkhead with a small tablet in hand. He wasn't dressed like flight staff. He moved like someone from the ground crew, summoned aboard mid-boarding but held back until takeoff. He stood just outside the cockpit, tapped at the screen, and frowned. His eyes scanned the cabin manifest, then flicked up to Langston. He took 2 steps forward, stopped near seat 1B, and tapped again. He glanced back toward the curtain as if waiting for permission to speak. But none came. Langston watched him shift on his feet before taking a slow step toward the galley, where the lead flight attendant stood stiff, arms folded. Their conversation was quiet but not silent. The young man's voice had a note of confusion in it, like someone pointing out a system error that should have been simple. The attendant's response was clipped and forceful. She shook her head once, glanced toward Langston's row, and whispered something through gritted teeth. The young man stepped back, lips pressed into a line, then turned and walked briskly back toward the cockpit with his tablet held tighter now. Langston's eyes followed him the entire way. Something had gone wrong, but not in the way they had pretended earlier. Not a reassignment, not a rebalancing, a falsified change. The man had seen it, confirmed it, and been silenced. Langston shifted his gaze to the seat beside him. 1B, now empty again. It had been briefly filled by the man in the pale blue shirt earlier, but that man had quietly moved to another section during the commotion, escorted not by crew, but by an airline rep with no visible ID. It was all too clean, too orchestrated. And now, as the curtain opened again, a new figure appeared. He wasn't a flight attendant or a pilot. He wore a dark suit, one of those Navy security blazers that blended into the corporate background of high-level transportation, but never boarded unless something required invisible eyes. He didn't speak. He walked directly to seat 1B and placed a black briefcase onto the floor, upright and silent, then buckled it into the seatbelt as if it belonged there. He didn't look at Langston. He didn't explain. He just turned and exited the cabin through the same curtain, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Langston did not move. His eyes locked on the briefcase. Its surface was smooth, matte leather, the kind used by government couriers and private executives who preferred silence over recognition. There was no name tag, no airline label, no boarding claim, just the case. The crew didn't acknowledge it. None of them mentioned its arrival. But something in the way they moved had changed again. Faster, sharper. Their smiles now strained, and their voices dropped an octave. Langston leaned back in his seat, scanning the passengers around him. Most had returned to their distractions, movies, music, meals, but a few were paying attention. A man in 2A kept glancing forward, pretending to scroll through his tablet while clearly watching the briefcase. A woman across the aisle held her coffee too tightly, her hands trembling slightly every time someone passed near it. The case had weight, not just physical, but political. It wasn't luggage. It was leverage. Langston understood now. The seat reassignment, the questioning, the confrontation, they weren't just about him. They were about timing, displacement, redirection. They had needed him removed from that seat long enough for the case to arrive. But why him? Why that seat? Why make it messy when it could have been clean? Unless they didn't expect someone like him to push back. Unless they believed his silence meant powerlessness. He turned slowly, glancing at the overhead bin above 1B. It was empty. No personal belongings. No jacket. No carry-on. The case was the only item in the vicinity, buckled in like a passenger. Like it had rights. As the minutes passed, a flight attendant passed through and paused for a beat beside the seat, adjusting the belt slightly, then moved on without comment. Langston caught the exchange of looks between her and the galley door. They were watching it, guarding it. Not for him, but for what came next. He looked down at his phone, the encrypted one, and began typing again. Cabin 1A. Object placed in adjacent seat. Unaccompanied. Flight 206. Possible illicit transfer. Escalate to Protocol 5. Then he powered it off. No alerts. No calls. Just silence. The plane remained in flight, engine steady, cruising altitude holding. To the untrained eye, everything appeared normal. But to Langston, this was no longer a flight. It was a front. A carefully managed distraction wrapped in procedural decorum, masking something far more dangerous. The crew's movements had become even more coordinated, tighter, and the glances they exchanged became quicker and more coded. Passengers grew quieter, not from fatigue, but from tension they couldn't fully name. Something unseen pulsed beneath the surface, and Langston could feel the pressure mount with every second that passed. The lead flight attendant returned from the galley, this time carrying nothing, moving slowly through the aisle like a warden taking silent inventory of a prison block. She stopped at row 3, whispered something inaudible to a younger colleague, then stepped forward and pressed the intercom button mounted above the front service station. A short chime rang out, drawing the attention of every passenger, and her voice followed, calm yet curiously formal, its tone different from the usual mid-flight announcements. Ladies and gentlemen, a reminder that Skylux Airlines reserves premium cabin services exclusively for guests who meet our elevated membership and security standards. At this time, we kindly ask all passengers to remain seated and refrain from unnecessary movement during our recalibrated service interval. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining the exclusive environment of our elite section. Langston noted the shift in phrasing. Recalibrated service interval, exclusive environment, elevated security standards. These weren't about comfort. They were about control. His eyes scanned the reactions of those seated near him. Some nodded vaguely, others looked confused, but a few glanced around with visible discomfort, as if being told for the first time that their presence was conditional. Several rows back, a woman in her late 20s with sharp features and cropped blonde hair slowly raised her phone and angled it discreetly toward the front of the cabin. Her fingers moved quickly as she began recording. Langston watched her expression tighten as her camera captured the briefcase, the seat arrangement, and possibly him. She wasn't recording for novelty. She was documenting. Whether for truth or for drama, he couldn't yet know. Seconds later, a male flight attendant noticed her. His steps quickened. He reached her row and leaned in, his voice low and firm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to delete that footage." The woman tilted her head, defensive posture rising. He continued, "Filming the forward cabin violates federal flight security policy. I'll need to verify that the video has been erased." She hesitated, glanced toward the front, and then back to her phone. Langston watched the moment, small in scale, massive in implication. The airline had shifted its tactics from exclusion to suppression. It wasn't just about who belonged anymore. It was about controlling the narrative. The woman scrolled through her screen, fingers trembling, and deleted the video under the watchful eye of the attendant. He gave a curt nod, then moved away without further incident. Around them, other passengers began checking their own phones, uncertain whether they too had crossed an invisible line. The silence thickened. Langston sat straighter. He tapped the edge of his phone once but didn't unlock it. Instead, he began counting backward in his head. Not seconds, not time, steps, variables, risks. If the briefcase beside him was what he suspected, a courier drop or an illicit data capsule, then its sudden placement, the enhanced announcements, and the video suppression were not coincidences. They were coordination. He closed his eyes briefly, filtering the last hour like code. Step 1, remove. Step 2, distract. Step 3, deliver. Step 4, suppress. Now they were in Step 5, secure. Not just the object, the narrative, the control. As if on cue, the lead flight attendant returned. She didn't speak. She stopped at 1B, checked the belt securing the briefcase, and moved her hand beneath the seat as if confirming a sensor or tracker had activated. Then she stepped back, gave a short nod to someone unseen through the curtain, and disappeared again. Langston exhaled quietly. Their timing was precise. Too precise. Whatever had been delivered beside him had now triggered a secondary protocol, likely encrypted, possibly linked to biometric scan or geolock command. And it had been done under the veil of humiliating him. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had chosen a target they assumed would stay quiet. They had not accounted for the wrong passenger occupying the right seat. A new chime echoed through the cabin, and the lights dimmed again. A soft instrumental played through the overhead speakers. Around him, passengers leaned back, hoping to escape into movies or drinks, pretending everything was fine. Langston looked forward. 1 row, 2 curtains. Beyond that, silence. But behind silence, systems were moving. Logs being updated. Video feeds rerouted. Cabin metrics aligned. He reached once more for his phone and typed a line. Device has landed. Package unsecured. Surveillance suppression confirmed. Flight 206. Proceed. He placed the phone face down on his tray and waited. The crew didn't see it. They weren't watching him anymore. In their minds, their operation had succeeded. They had done what they were told. Followed policy. Removed a threat. Moved the object. Neutralized exposure. Except they hadn't. Not really. Not yet. Langston looked to his left. The briefcase sat there, pristine, undisturbed. But no object stays untouched forever. The flight would land eventually. And when it did, the real hands would come. The real names would be checked. The footage would surface. The report would trigger. And those who thought they had sealed the truth inside a compartment and buckled it in would discover the truth was already walking off the plane with a sharper memory than any device could carry. He knew that, and more importantly, someone else did too. He reached down slowly, retrieved the slim matte black device from beneath his tray, and typed 5 words with deliberate precision. Execute as previously instructed. The message sent instantly through a secure channel, encrypted and rerouted through 3 international nodes. It didn't ping. It didn't confirm. It didn't need to. It simply disappeared into the system like a command to a hidden army, silently initiating a chain reaction far beyond this aircraft's walls. Moments passed. Nothing changed. Then everything did. Somewhere behind the scenes, beyond the cabin and galley, a shift began that no one in first class could see. The cockpit received a signal routed through a corporate override channel. The message bore an internal priority flag usually reserved for emergency board directives, marked with 3 red slashes that meant no delay, no denial, no discretion. Flight 206. Immediate review. Elevate passenger priority. Ellison Reynolds Langston. Confirmed seat 1A. Instruction. Cease all procedural interference. Re-establish full access. Director level override in effect. Relay to lead flight crew and security liaison. Simultaneously, a second message reached the handheld tablet of the lead flight attendant. It bypassed her standard notifications and flashed red across the screen. Recall instruction. Status shift required. Priority individual in cabin. Confirmed identity match. Halt current enforcement. Communicate directly with operations. Her fingers froze above the screen. She read it again, then once more. She looked up sharply toward the front of the cabin, her previously calm expression giving way to a sudden flare of uncertainty. She stepped quickly through the curtain into the galley, whispered something into the headset clipped beneath her collar, and waited. From the other side of the curtain, Langston heard the static of a reply come through. It wasn't loud, but it was urgent. It carried the kind of tone that people used when they realized they had made a mistake they couldn't undo. A few rows away, the young woman who had been forced to delete her video began to notice the energy shift as well. The flight crew had stopped hovering. The glances had stopped shooting toward him. The briefcase, once so carefully monitored, now seemed to have lost its gravitational pull. It sat there unguarded, forgotten even, as if someone had quietly decided it no longer mattered. But Langston knew it did. He closed his phone, slid it back into his coat, and slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He rose without urgency, stretched slightly, and stepped into the aisle. No one stopped him this time. He walked toward the front of the cabin with a quiet authority, one that didn't demand space. It simply created it. Passengers leaned back slightly to let him pass. Even those who had sneered at him earlier now looked on with a strange mix of discomfort and curiosity, unable to process what had changed but sensing it all the same. As Langston reached the galley, the lead flight attendant turned quickly, her composure crumbling under the weight of new information. "Sir," she began, her voice softer now, nearly breathless, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Behind her, a second crew member was on a separate call, whispering into a phone marked with an embossed Skylux insignia. The conversation was short, one-sided, full of rapid affirmatives. The moment he hung up, he stepped forward and met Langston's gaze. His demeanor had shifted completely. "Sir, I've just been informed of your status. Please accept our deepest apologies. We were unaware of..." He stopped himself, realizing there was no dignified way to finish the sentence. Langston said nothing. He looked past them to the seat that had caused so much trouble, then to the briefcase, then back to the crew. There was nothing theatrical in his expression. No gloating. Just stillness, and behind it, reckoning. The truth had arrived. Not shouted, not announced, just confirmed. One line of code, one verified identity, and the power dynamics Inside, the aircraft collapsed like paper underwater. Passengers who had once looked at him with dismissal now watched him with a kind of wary confusion, as if struggling to rewrite the image they had built of him in their minds. Who was he? Why had the tone shifted? Why was the crew now standing straighter, speaking softer, checking systems more obsessively? In the cockpit, the pilot received a new file containing full biometric credentials for Langston, along with an internal bulletin marking him as a Tier 1 executive under Skylux Group Strategic Global Acquisition Board. Effective authority across intercontinental operations. Not an investor, not a consultant. The owner of the deal no one had seen coming. Langston walked back to his seat. No one moved to help him. And yet every eye in first class had shifted toward him with a new tension, no longer driven by discomfort or prejudice, but something colder, uncertainty. What had they missed? What had they just witnessed? Why had the tone of the entire crew bent at the knee without a single protest? Langston remained seated in 1A, unmoving, watching the cabin with eyes that no longer searched for dignity or fairness, but calculated consequence. The briefcase in 1B still sat untouched, still buckled into its seat, but it had lost its mystery. He knew now, without question, that it had been placed there deliberately, not by accident, not for his safety, but for concealment. And it was no coincidence that it had followed the man who had previously been assigned that seat. Charles Danton, a corporate operative Langston had encountered before, a man known for discreet sabotage and influence peddling within high-level mergers. Danton had boarded early under false VIP designation, likely arranged by a corrupt executive still embedded within the airline's upper ranks. Langston had already been tracking the pattern. Sudden changes in seat assignment logs, internal accounts shifting oversight documents from one account to another, routes altered mid-flight under the guise of scheduling conflict. Now the briefcase confirmed it. Inside it would be no ordinary documents. There would be encrypted ledgers, perhaps storage drives or physical contracts linked to a shell company laundering investments through a joint venture intended to block Langston's acquisition deal. The deal in question, a $2 billion strategic takeover of Skylux Airlines, had been in the works for 11 months, a silent operation buried beneath layers of shell entities and offshore bidding. It had taken Langston's team nearly a year to pierce the firewall surrounding the board's private financial ties. But once they had, the outcome became inevitable. 3 days prior, Langston had signed the final phase of the acquisition agreement. The press would know in 48 hours. But someone on the inside had found out early, and now, with a case full of sensitive data and a corrupted executive quietly smuggled on board, they had hoped to plant just enough confusion, discredit his presence, trigger a minor scandal, maybe even leak false footage to stall the announcement and force his hand. Except they'd failed, spectacularly, because instead of quietly sitting in economy and disappearing under pressure, Langston had chosen this flight for a reason. He had known. He had let them make the first move. And now it was his turn. Without a word, he stood again, straightened the lapel of his blazer, and stepped into the aisle. Every motion was deliberate, clean. He walked forward past the flight attendants now frozen in place, their eyes wide with confusion and fear, and stopped just behind the front galley curtain. A member of the security detail, previously invisible, now stepped into view. Langston didn't need to explain. The man reached into his jacket, handed over a clearance badge marked with the emblem of Skylux Holdings, and stepped aside. Langston moved forward, turned toward the passengers, and finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was clear, calm, and carried the weight of finality. My name is Ellison Langston. I am chairman of Langston Capital Group. As of 3 days ago, we finalized acquisition of controlling interest in Skylux Airlines. As of this moment, this aircraft, its personnel, and its systems fall under that governance. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others lowered their phones, unsure whether to record or delete what they had already captured. The lead flight attendant stepped forward, pale, lips parted, but no words came. She understood now. Everyone did. Langston continued. The passenger who was briefly assigned seat 1B, Mr. Charles Danton, is no longer aboard this aircraft. He disembarked shortly after a directive was issued. He is currently being detained by federal investigators awaiting him at the arrival gate. What's inside that briefcase belongs to a criminal investigation regarding financial misconduct and deliberate interference in a corporate acquisition protected under international economic law. The briefcase will remain untouched until federal retrieval protocol is engaged upon landing. Langston turned then, his voice unwavering. The actions taken aboard this flight to alter seating arrangements, discredit a passenger, and tamper with internal security policy will be reviewed. Some of you cooperated with it knowingly. Others stood by. That silence has been documented. There was no anger in his tone, no judgment, just the undeniable truth of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The weight of the announcement settled like fog over the passengers. No one spoke. No one moved. The man in seat 2C, who had earlier commented about who belonged where, now stared down at his folded hands. The woman who had laughed during the early confrontation sat rigid, her expression locked in a quiet panic. The lead attendant took a step back, her voice brittle as she finally managed to whisper, "Sir, we didn't know." Langston looked at her and answered simply. Rebecca, the lead flight attendant who had orchestrated the initial humiliation of Langston with cool indifference, stood near the cockpit bulkhead staring blankly at the locked tablet in her hands. The latest system message was not one she could override. Her access had been restricted, her clearance revoked, and most damning of all, her personnel record had been flagged with an internal security code she'd never seen before. It read Category Red, Conduct Review Pending. That meant immediate administrative hold upon landing, loss of active duty status, and mandatory internal investigation. The code had come directly from executive command. Her headset buzzed with clipped instructions from a compliance officer waiting at the gate. Her voice caught in her throat as she responded with the only word she could manage. "Understood. I will report for questioning." She had built a reputation over the years as firm but fair, efficient but strict, a woman who knew how to read the room and command respect. But she now realized her judgment had not been neutral. It had been conditioned, flawed, tainted. What it felt like protocol at the time, questioning a passenger's identity, doubting a seat assignment, directing enforcement, now stood exposed as a pattern of bias she could no longer rationalize. She had humiliated a man she knew nothing about because her instinct told her he didn't belong. And that instinct had been wrong, fatally wrong. The rest of the crew, once aligned with her every movement, now stood detached, awaiting individual review. None of them had intervened when Langston was pulled from his seat. None had questioned the reassignment. One of them had laughed quietly during the conflict. Another had ignored a drink request. All of it was recorded. All of it was stored. The internal surveillance system had captured more than just passenger behavior. It had documented crew performance, reactions, expressions, even unspoken complicity. In the world of aviation security and executive accountability, perception had become data, and data had become evidence. Langston hadn't said another word since revealing his identity. He hadn't needed to. The mechanisms he had set in motion were now accelerating without him. As the plane lowered toward the tarmac, the control tower relayed clearance codes not just to the pilot, but to the airline's operations division. On the ground, 3 men in navy jackets marked with regulatory insignia waited near the jet bridge, clipboards in hand, faces stern, and eyes scanning passenger manifests fed to them in real time. One of them carried a sealed envelope marked with a Skylux security stamp. Another wore an earpiece and spoke in quiet tones with corporate legal. They weren't waiting to welcome guests. They were waiting to remove names. Across the cabin, one of the earlier passengers, a man who had mocked Langston with a half-swallowed joke and a sideways smirk, sat hunched in his seat now, face flushed, hands trembling. His name was Thomas Greaves, a senior partner at a luxury real estate firm with long-standing ties to airline executives. He had assumed, as many had, that class bought immunity. That status protected prejudice. that a quiet insult whispered between privilege would remain invisible. But he was wrong. Langston's legal team had already received screen captures of his behavior. His seatmate had reported the comment. The woman with the deleted footage had re-uploaded a cached version of the recording to a cloud server connected to a consumer protection watchdog. And Skylux, under its new executive authority, had issued its first permanent passenger ban in 12 months. Thomas Greaves' travel privileges across all domestic Skylux flights were rescinded, not suspended, revoked, indefinitely. A quiet alert on his frequent flyer account now read, "Access blocked. Violation of ethics policy." In his lap, his phone buzzed repeatedly with unanswered calls. He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. In the galley, Rebecca turned toward her team with a look that bordered on apology, but no one returned it. The junior attendant who had hesitated earlier, who had almost spoken up before being silenced by a glare, now stood with her arms crossed, her eyes hollow. She would be cleared. Her hesitation, though not vocalized, had been noticed. She had accessed the passenger log to verify Langston's ticket during the incident. That query, time-stamped and documented, now stood as her defense. She had tried. The others hadn't. Langston sat still as the aircraft touched down, tires chirping against the concrete, reverse thrusters roaring briefly before the plane coasted down the runway toward its gate. Outside, dawn had broken fully, casting soft light across the terminal. But inside, another kind of reckoning had arrived. For those who had participated in the mistreatment, the descent had not ended at touchdown. It had only begun. No apologies had been offered, no explanations provided. But Langston didn't need them. He had never sought justice in the form of confession. He understood that accountability, real accountability, rarely arrived as a gesture of goodwill. It came through consequence. The terminal gate had long since emptied of its passengers, and the echoes of luggage wheels and boarding announcements faded into the background as the final traces of Flight 206 were processed and filed away. What remained was a silence that felt heavier than the aircraft that had just landed, a silence that belonged to the aftermath, not the chaos, not the confrontation, but the quiet reckoning that always follows a public unmasking. Rebecca stood alone near the crew corridor, uniform creased, name tag removed, shoulders slumped not from fatigue, but from the internal collapse of certainty. She had not spoken since the plane touched ground. She had fulfilled her duties without deviation, assisting disembarkation with a mechanical rhythm, her voice polite, her eyes averted. But now, with the aircraft sealed behind her and her colleagues already escorted to internal debriefings, she remained in place, unable to walk away, not because she had nowhere to go, but because there was one thing left unfinished. Across the concourse, Langston stood by the executive gate exit, coat over one arm, briefcase still in hand, a quiet wall of private security and legal aides forming a perimeter that kept distance without creating spectacle. The terminal staff recognized him now. Everyone did, yet no one dared approach. His presence was no longer questioned, but it still unsettled. Rebecca gathered herself, stepped forward, and asked to speak to him. The security lead turned toward Langston, waiting for a response. Langston nodded once. She was brought forward. For a moment, neither spoke. He waited, and she realized he would not offer her relief from her discomfort. She would have to earn that herself. Her voice cracked on the first word, but steadied quickly. She told him the truth. Not excuses. Not apologies drenched in deflection. The truth. She told him that her actions on board had not been anomalies, but results. Results of years spent in a culture that trained her to look for certain signs, expect certain attitudes, favor certain passengers. She admitted that when she saw him in that seat, her mind did not go to theft or error, but to presumption. A presumption shaped by years of subtle reinforcement that certain faces belonged and others didn't. She said that she had believed herself to be fair, and in that belief, had become blind to the real weight of her decisions. That fairness was not neutrality. It was responsibility, and she had failed that responsibility. She confessed that as she watched the layers of the situation unravel in the cabin, something inside her had fractured, something she had spent years avoiding. the part of herself that knew better, the voice she had silenced in favor of procedure. She said she didn't want forgiveness, only clarity. And then she said something Langston hadn't expected. She had resigned, voluntarily, not out of fear or guilt, but because she understood that returning to that role would mean accepting the lie that she could still do it without first unlearning everything that had brought her to this moment. She told him she had already applied to a program in social behavioral studies, focusing on race, power, and perception in service environments. She didn't want to work for airlines anymore. She wanted to study the systems that built them. She wanted to confront the spaces where bias became protocol. And then, maybe, return not as staff, but as someone who could teach others how to see clearly before making someone feel invisible. Langston listened, not with the detached gaze of a man used to apologies, but with the steady silence of someone weighing more than words. When she finished, he simply said, "Start with that." And then he turned and left. No public gesture, no absolution, just acknowledgement. Weeks passed. Months followed. The story of Flight 206 broke globally within days, reshared across news outlets, used in panel discussions, cited in debates around corporate conduct, racial bias, and silent structures of exclusion. But unlike most scandals, the news cycle didn't swallow it and move on. It grew. Langston didn't fuel it. He didn't monetize it. Instead, he redirected attention toward policy change. He overhauled the internal training standards across every Skylux division, introduced implicit bias detection protocols for flight operations, and implemented a new AI-assisted passenger monitoring system that flagged discriminatory behavior, not in passengers, but in staff. Rebecca's name never appeared in the press, but those who watched closely noticed her again, almost a year later, speaking quietly at a university seminar about behavioral architecture in public service. Her voice was firm now, but never loud. She taught about coded behavior, about how bias lives in routine, how policy can carry prejudice when no one is looking. She spoke to future service workers, policy designers, young leaders about how she had once followed rules perfectly and still participated in harm, and how harm, when dressed in professionalism, can do the most damage. She eventually founded a nonprofit, the Line of Sight Initiative, focused on restructuring internal bias education in aviation, hospitality, and healthcare. Her work reached training centers, international conferences, and corporate partnerships. She changed something, not because she had been forced to, but because she had chosen to. Langston never saw her again. He didn't need to. His part in the story had never been about exposure or destruction. It had always been about truth. The flight had ended, but its course still echoed across decisions made long after the wheels touched the ground. Some had mocked, some had watched, some had acted, and some, like Rebecca, had changed. And in that change, the arc of justice bent quietly toward redemption. Not all stories end with punishment. Some end with understanding, and the courage to never repeat the silence that allowed injustice to feel routine. The end. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more narratives that challenge injustice and spotlight redemption. What moment in Langston's journey hit you the hardest? Which part made you pause and think? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.